That February evening in 1933 in Berlin was cold and bleak. Erich Weiss, a young literature teacher, had stayed late at school grading papers. Walking home through the dark streets, he saw a glow in the sky. The Reichstag building was on fire. Erich didn't know it then, but this fire would become more than a blaze. It would be a signal for the hunt to begin, a hunt for people like him. Just a few hours after the fire, the emergency decree for the protection of the people and the state was published. It sounded righteous, didn't it? Protection. But in reality, this document was a death sentence for the rule of law. It abolished freedom of the person, assembly, and the press. Now, a person could be arrested without trial simply on suspicion. Legality no longer existed. Its place was taken by necessity, and the hunt began. Most often at night, a knock on the door, firm, indifferent, not asking but demanding. Just such a knock sounded on Erich Weiss's door 2 weeks later. On the doorstep were figures in leather coats. Their glances slid over him as if he were an object. No names, no warrants, just a short, "Get ready. You are arrested under the decree." The reason? Last week in class he had mentioned poems by Heine, and his desk mate, the son of a local Nazi functionary, had reported that Weiss was spreading anti-German ideas. Where to? The prisons were overcrowded, so the Nazis showed monstrous ingenuity. They created a parallel universe, a system of wild camps. They were set up in whatever was available, in abandoned factory workshops that smelled of machine oil and fear, in the gloomy halls of ancient castles where echoes swallowed moans. It was to such a place, a former factory shop in Oranienburg, that Erich was brought. Here, law did not reign, but arbitrariness. The guards, drunken SA stormtroopers, were settling scores from past street fights. Torture was commonplace. The goal was not just to isolate, but to break, humiliate, and erase human dignity. In the barracks next to Erich was Johann Schulze, a tailor from Dortmund. His guilt was different. Johann was a Bibelforscher, a Jehovah's Witness. He refused to serve in the army, give the Nazi salute, or swear allegiance to the Führer. His principle was simple and terrifying for the regime. We must obey God as ruler rather than men. He was offered freedom in exchange for a tiny signature, a renunciation of his faith. Johann would look at the paper, then at the prison bars, and silently turn away. He preferred the camp, but chaos is a poor tool for long-term terror. And in March 1933, a place appeared that would become the prototype, the model for the entire future giant system: Dachau. Unlike the wild camps, Dachau was meticulously planned from the very beginning. Its creator was Heinrich Himmler, a pedantic and cruel bureaucrat. Here, terror was put into uniform for the first time, subjected to a strict routine, and turned into a routine procedure. Every prisoner was assigned a number. A personal file was opened. There was a set of rules, for the slightest violation of which, death. The infamous 10 Rules of Dachau, read to every new arrival. For every offense, shooting will follow. Escape is pointless. This was not just a prison. It was a school, as Himmler cynically called it, a school where re-education was conducted through hunger, exhausting labor, and constant fear. And so, the first pupils of this school arrived. Erich Weiss received a red triangle, political. His former student, the one who had denounced him, was now presumably preparing for a career in the new state. Johann Schulze wore a purple triangle, Bibelforscher, and next to them was a third man, Karl Richter, a homeless man from Hamburg, a black triangle, a social. He had been picked up during a raid on a flophouse. He was simply inconvenient. He didn't fit the ideal of the people's community. His crime was that he had no home or job. The main weapon was not the pistol, but the fear born of uncertainty. People weren't always arrested for something specific. Often, it was on suspicion. This absurdity paralyzed the will. Neighbor feared neighbor, colleague feared colleague. Denunciation became a civic virtue. The Gestapo apparatus, which in Berlin in 1933 numbered only 50 people, grew like a cancerous tumor, feeding on this fear. The state was learning to devour its own citizens. For now, quietly, without unnecessary noise. There were no gas chambers yet. There was no final solution yet. But the monstrous mechanism had been set in motion. Erich Weiss, dying of dysentery in the barracks, remembered the faces of his students. Johann Schulze, losing strength from hunger, whispered prayers. Karl Richter, whom everyone considered a nobody, for the first time felt a strange connection with these people. They were all equally alien now. And the most terrible thing was that millions of Germans, seeing how the others, the marginalized, the dissidents, the different, were taken away, sighed with relief. It won't happen to me. They did not yet know that the totalitarian machine always finds a new enemy, and that sooner or later it would reach everyone, every single one. By 1936, the German camp system was no longer an improvisation. It had taken shape, grown stronger, and developed its own charter, its own hierarchy, its own deadly rhythm. But if initially the terror was mostly political, Nazi ideology now demanded a new, far more terrible sacrifice: the biological purity of the nation. In September 1935, the infamous Nuremberg laws were passed. Newspapers trumpeted the protection of German blood and German honor, but behind these pompous words lay simple animal hatred. Jews were stripped of their citizenship and forbidden to marry Aryans. But this was only the visible part of the iceberg. At the same time, in a small Bavarian town, Anna Schmidt, a simple rural teacher, received a notice from the local guardianship court. She was ordered to appear for a medical examination. Anna had a congenital limp, a consequence of polio in her childhood. She had lived with this minor peculiarity all her life, taught children, loved poetry and music. She could not have imagined that the state would suddenly take an interest in her leg. The commission lasted 10 minutes. A doctor, without looking her in the eye, muttered something about hereditary degeneration and damage to the nation's genetic pool. A week later, the official verdict came: incorrigible hereditary disease, physical defect, subject to sterilization according to the law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring. For Anna, this was a blow worse than any arrest. To her, never married but dreaming of a family and children, the cold hands of the state were invading the most intimate part of her life, her right to motherhood. She tried to protest, wrote petitions, but was told the decision was final and not subject to appeal. The operation was performed in a local clinic. Lying on the gurney, Anna heard a nurse in the corridor say to an orderly, "Another one," cleansing the gene pool. While Anna Schmidt was recovering from her operation, in Berlin, Frau Martha Huber, the widow of a respectable burgher, was writing a statement to the Gestapo about her neighbor, Frau Elsa. She lived alone, rarely left the house, and Martha was sure she was hiding communist literature. The real reason was simpler. Frau Elsa had once refused to lend Martha some sugar, and she had held a grudge Now, under the guise of a vigilant citizen, she was settling a personal score. Frau Elsa was arrested as politically unreliable and sent to Moringen, one of the first camps for women. Her crime was being an inconvenient neighbor. The camp system multiplied. Alongside Dachau, Sachsenhausen, and Buchenwald appeared. The labor of the prisoners ceased to be merely educational. It became an economic resource. Prisoners in striped uniforms with sewn-on triangles, green for criminals, black for asocials, pink for homosexuals, built roads, worked in quarries, sewed uniforms for the Wehrmacht. They became living merchandise that generated income for the SS. In the Sachsenhausen camp, the fates of Anna Schmidt, Frau Elsa, and millions of other enemies of the Reich intersected. Anna, who had undergone forced sterilization, was deemed irreparably damaged genetic material and sent there as inferior. Frau Elsa, broken by interrogations, received a black triangle as an asocial. They met in the same barracks, a crippled teacher and a woman slandered by her neighbors. They were united by one thing: the state had decided they had no right to a normal life. Society, for the most part, silently approved of this policy. Propaganda tirelessly droned on about the healthy national body, from which sick limbs must be amputated. People on the streets reading the newspapers nodded, yes, of course, the sick and the deformed must be sterilized so they don't reproduce. The asocials must be re-educated through labor. They did not see behind these slogans the fate of Anna Schmidt, deprived of her future, or the fate of Frau Elsa, whose life was destroyed by a neighbor's slander. The machine learned to work more precisely and ruthlessly. It was no longer just eliminating political opponents. It was taking aim at the very essence of human existence, the right to family, to love, to one's own body. And the most terrible thing was that millions, seeing how the inferior and the others were being crippled and destroyed, still thought, it won't happen to me. They did not understand that the next target could be anyone who deviated in any way from the invented norm. The boundaries of this norm were narrowing every day. September 1939. The roar of German tanks crossing the border into Poland echoed behind the barbed wire of the German concentration camps. For the prisoners, this thunder was not a beginning, but a continuation of their personal war, a war of annihilation that the state had been waging against them for 6 years. But now, everything changed. With the start of World War II, the terror became total. The camps ceased to be an instrument of re-education. They became a conveyor belt of death, a vital link in the economy of destruction. In the barracks of Buchenwald, the fates of 3 people, whose paths had begun so differently, became intertwined in a bitter knot. Franz Huber, a former Social Democrat, Red Triangle. In the past, a union leader at the Siemens plant. He had been arrested back in 1935 for subversive activities. He had tried to organize a strike. Now he was an old camp inmate, a Muselmann, as they called those who had survived against all odds. His knowledge and will had helped him secure the relatively privileged position of a camp clerk. Hans Müller, Purple Triangle, a Jehovah's Witness, a farmer from Bavaria. In 1939, he received a draft notice for the Wehrmacht. He wrote on it, "I will not kill on the orders of a man. My conscience belongs to God." He was sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted to the camp. The state needed slave labor, not martyrs. Hans was quiet, unshakable. He refused to work in arms production and was starved in the punishment bunker. Peter Schulze, Black Triangle. He was 20 years old and he was asocial. His crime? He was the son of a prostitute and an unknown father, grew up in an orphanage, and had been a drifter. In 1940, he was picked up in a raid on idlers. He was young and strong, but completely broken in spirit. He didn't understand why he had been thrown in here. The war gave the camp administration new, monstrous powers. Any offense was considered sabotage of the war effort. For being late for roll call, for stealing a potato, for looking at a guard, instant execution. Labor became true hard labor. Prisoners were driven to the underground Mittelwerk factories, where, under inhuman conditions, they assembled V-1 and V-2 flying bombs, weapons of vengeance meant to bring death to others. Franz Huber, sitting in his office, played a double game. As a clerk, he compiled lists of work details. He tried to assign the weakest to lighter work and the strongest to places where there was a chance of survival. He saw Hans Müller being kept in a damp bunker for a month for refusing to assemble bomb parts. He saw Peter Schulze, that frightened boy, beaten half to death for fainting from hunger at his workbench. One winter day in 1942, Franz took a risk. He forged a list, including Peter, in a crew working in a warm warehouse. But someone informed. The Gestapo burst into the barracks. Franz and Peter were dragged out into the frost. "Sabotage!" screamed the SS Unterscharführer. "Sabotage of the war effort!" Peter, trembling with fear, was stood against the wall. A volley rang out. Franz, however, as a valuable specialist, was not shot. He was sentenced to 25 blows with a cane on the back, and he had to count them out loud himself. 1, 2, 3. After the 10th blow, he lost count. A guard prompted him with a kick of his boot. 11, swine! This humiliation was worse than the pain. Lying in the infirmary, Franz stared at the ceiling and thought not of his own back, but of Peter's face in that last second. He was just a boy, whose only crime was that he had no home, and Hans Müller survived. He, weakened, was transferred to an invalid crew. He hauled stones. Every day he saw how the weakest, those who could not get up, were taken to the sanitary barracks, from which no one returned. He knew his turn was coming. The war outside and the war inside the camp merged into one. The camp became a microcosm of the Third Reich, a world where human life was worthless, where denunciation was the norm, where death was routine. And Franz Huber, the old anti-fascist, and Hans Müller, the religious pacifist, and the dead Peter Schulze, the asocial, they were all equally alien in this new world. They were expendable material in the total war that the state was waging against its own people, and the conveyor belt of death was gaining speed. April 1945, the rumble of Soviet artillery grew ever clearer from the east. From the west, the shots of American patrols could already be heard. In Buchenwald camp, an unimaginable mixture of horror, hope, and agony reigned. The SS were burning documents in a panic, trying to hide the scale of the crimes. The prisoners, exhausted but still alive, were preparing for a last desperate fight for survival. On April 11, 1945, an uprising broke out in the camp. Prisoners, among them Franz Huber, attacked the guards with homemade weapons. They managed to take control of the camp before the arrival of American troops. The gates were opened, a liberation that was not freedom. The first American soldiers to enter the camp turned pale with horror. Piles of corpses stacked like firewood, living skeletons with burning eyes, unable even to smile. Among these living dead was Franz Huber. He stood, leaning on a stick, and looked at the sun, which he had not seen behind the barbed wire for 8 years. His body was free, but his mind remained there behind the wire. Hans Müller, the Jehovah's Witness, was found in the invalid barracks. He could not walk. When an American soldier tried to give him chocolate, Hans slowly, with a trembling hand, pushed it away and whispered, "Thank you, but I am fasting today." They had survived. But what awaited them outside the gates? Return to a country that did not want to remember them. Franz Huber returned to his hometown. His apartment was occupied by a new family. "We were told you wouldn't return," a woman said indifferently at the door. His former Union colleagues were either dead or tried not to remember the past. When Franz tried to get compensation as a victim of Nazism, an official in the office looked at him suspiciously. "How can you prove you were in the camp for political reasons? Maybe you were there as a criminal." He demanded certificates, documents, evidence, but most of the documents had been burned. His own memory, the scars on his back, and the number tattooed on his arm were not considered proof. Hans Müller returned to his Bavarian village. The local priest refused to receive him, calling him a sectarian. Former neighbor farmers, who had once respected him, now turned away. His farm had been confiscated and given to a loyal German. Hans did not demand it back. He moved to a remote village and lived until the end of his days in a small hut, communicating with no one except his fellow believers. The fate of the forgotten victims. While political prisoners like Franz struggled immensely to gain recognition, other categories of victims were completely erased from public memory. The asocials. No one remembered Peter Schulze and thousands like him. In the public consciousness, they remained criminals, vagrants, prostitutes. The state, now a democratic one, saw no need to rehabilitate them. Many survivors hid their past, fearing a new stigma. Homosexuals. For them, liberation did not arrive. Paragraph 175, which criminalized homosexuality, remained in force in the Federal Republic of Germany in its unaltered Nazi form. Former prisoners with pink triangles were arrested again and sent to prison, now legally. Their suffering was only officially recognized in the 1990s. Victims of forced sterilization. People like Anna Schmidt, deprived of the ability to have children, received no compensation. Their trauma was considered a private matter, not a state crime. They were forced to remain silent about their shame. The long road to a memorial. Franz Huber lived a long life. He never married, never had children. At night, he often screamed in his sleep. He attended survivors' meetings, looked at the faces of other old men like him with faded tattoos on their arms. They understood each other without words. In the 1980s, when a generation that had not experienced the war came to lead West Germany, a slow reassessment of the past began. Franz, now a white-haired old man, gave testimony to historians. He spoke not only of himself, but also of Hans Müller, of the boy Peter, of all the forgotten victims. In the 1990s, after German reunification, memorials to gay and lesbian victims of Nazism were finally erected. The asocials and Jehovah's Witnesses were officially rehabilitated. The state finally recognized that persecution is persecution, regardless of the reason. Franz Huber did not live to see this moment. He died in 1987, but his testimony, his struggle for memory, helped make it happen. The story of Franz, Hans, Peter, and Anna is not just a story about the past. It is a warning for the future. It shows how easily society agrees to marginalize the others, be they the homeless, migrants, dissidents, or sexual minorities. How quickly the phrase enemy of the people finds a resonance in the hearts of ordinary people. The memory of the forgotten victims is a test of our own humanity. It is a question not for Germany in the 1940s, but for us today. Whom are we willing to recognize as a victim? Whose suffering do we consider worthy of memory? And are we repeating the mistakes of the past by easily labeling those who are not like us? Because the machinery of destruction never starts with the gas chambers. It starts with a denunciation, with indifference, with the words, "It won't happen to me."